All right. Good afternoon and good morning for those in Asia. I'm Gyuk Shin, Director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford. I hope that you are doing well despite all the challenges that we have these days, biological, economic, political, or geopolitical. So this is the second in our webinar series this quarter on the theme of shifting geopolitics and US-Asia relations. As you know, we have many challenges facing Asia and US-Asia relations, from the rise of populist nationalism to US-China conflict, and foreign policy and security issues often become politicized. And today our focus is on South Asia. So we have many more exciting programs. So please visit our website at the center. So today I'm really happy to introduce Arzan Tarapore, who will lead today's seminar. Arzan joined us just last month, and he's a top expert on South Asia, but also served in the Defense Ministry of Australia for many years. So Arzan covers a wide range of issues in the Indo-Pacific region, and he is leading our program on South Asia at the center. So without further ado, now I'll turn over to Arzan.
Great, thank you very much, Gyuk. It is a distinct honor and really good fun to restart these South Asia events at Stanford. We are planning actually to have 3 South Asia events this quarter through to the end of this year on the theme of India-China strategic competition. I'll plug events numbers 2 and 3 towards the end of this webinar. But today, as Gyuk said, the debut, the inaugural webinar, deals with the headline event of the year in India-China relations, which is the crisis on the LAC, the line of actual control that separates India and China in the Himalayas. We are joined today by 3 actual experts. Dr. Joseph Felter, a former DASD for South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania in the first half of the Trump administration, 2017 to 2019. And now a professor at Stanford. So he was at the time in charge of US policy towards South Asia, or at least US defense policy towards South Asia. We have Tanvi Madan, who is a senior fellow and the director of the India project at the Brookings Institution, and Yun Sun, who is a senior fellow and the director of the China program at the Stimson Institute, both in Washington, DC. So welcome all. Thank you very much for sharing your time and your expert views today. So the way I think we'll run this today is to first let me take just a couple of minutes to give a common overview of what's actually happened with the crisis this year so that we're all on the same page. And then we can have a moderated discussion and hopefully some Q&A from those who have braved the late evening or early morning hours at the end. So if you are listening in live, then please use the chat function to submit your questions, and I'll moderate a couple of them at the end. So let's begin. In late April or early May, the PLA, the Chinese army, launched multiple near simultaneous incursions into Ladakh, on the western sector of the LAC, as well as into Sikkim. And in early May, there was some scuffles at Pangong So, which seemed to be relatively routine type of stuff. But despite the scale of incursions, despite the number of troops and the number of points at which the incursions occurred, which was not normal at all, Indian military and political leaders insisted that this was in fact just routine cross-LAC activity. And according to routine, the ground military commanders on the ground had meetings. At a Corps commanders meeting, a 3-star level meeting in early June, there was an agreement to disengage and pull back from their advanced positions. But on the 15th of June, in the midst of this so-called disengagement, there was a skirmish where in hand-to-hand combat, 20 Indian soldiers were killed in action and an unknown number of Chinese soldiers were killed in action. And both sides were pretty keen, or the leadership on both sides was pretty keen to avoid escalation and downplayed the skirmish to avoid things getting out of hand. But still, popular opinion turned pretty angry in India. And by this time, it was quite clear to everyone that this crisis was different. This was not the same old patrolling and incursion that happens most years. So despite some continuing disengagement, including from the site of that skirmish, both sides reinforced their positions militarily in coming weeks. And in late August, the Indian troops took position on a handful of peaks in the Kailash range on their own side of the LAC, south of Pangong Tso. And there were a few days where both sides scrambled to gain tactical advantage around Pangong Tso. Tensions escalated, shots were fired, although thankfully no casualties as a result of those shots. And there was, for at least a few days or a couple of weeks, talk of war. Foreign ministers met in Moscow on the 10th of September, agreed to cool tensions and respect the old agreements and confidence building measures, which by that stage looked as though they were in tatters. And this foreign ministers meeting was followed by another corps commanders meeting, which was the 6th of this crisis, where they agreed to essentially freeze activity on the front line. Both sides, however, despite the sort of cooling of tensions, both sides are digging in and have continued military activity unabated to dig in and reinforce their positions. The PLA still occupies significant land on the Indian side of the LAC, especially around Pangong Tso and most importantly at the Depsang Plains, which is operationally valuable to both sides. Talks are continuing, but on the ground, it's pretty clear that both sides are digging in for the long haul. So that's the rough situation on the ground. Now let's zoom out. We're not here to discuss which side occupies how much land or where the LAC really is, but let's talk about some strategic issues. And let's begin with Joe Felter, who unfortunately has to leave early to do his day job and actually teach a class. Let's begin with discussion of US policy. So Joe, if I can ask you, for those sitting in Washington, for policymakers in Washington, if you can sort of assume that persona, do you think for the US, this crisis reveals anything new, or does it nuance or update US policy towards the Indo-Pacific, especially with regard to, for example, the character of the strategic character of China? Does this reveal China to be more aggressive than we previously thought, or does this just confirm our priors?
Well, thanks, Arzan. First, just thanks for the chance to join you. It's a great initiative. So thanks, Gil, for hosting, and just wanted to be with old colleagues Tanvi and Yun-Sun. I'm a big fan of both of their work. But let's say, is it something new? I might argue that with a timeline, a lot of people give the CCP a lot of credit for playing the calculated long game. But it seems a little bit reckless to me what they're doing. Picking a fight with a nuclear power, with the 4th largest military, with all that's going on in the region, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other distractions. It doesn't strike me as a real prudent calculation of risk versus gain. But really, I think it's consistent. These actions in some ways are consistent with the assessment of China that we've made in our national security strategy, our national defense strategy. We need to look at China for who they are, not who we want them to be. They are aggressively seeking influence, if not dominance in the region. And I think they're hoping to make and consolidate these incremental gains, maybe make them a fait accompli. So yeah, I think our strategy, our national defense strategy, which certainly we followed when I was serving. It's we're going to need to compete with China, and we're going to need to compete effectively and work closely with our allies and partners that share this similar vision. So I think it's just China revealing its true colors, and we have a strategy that's designed to address that. And we're going to have to work with our allies and partners to make sure that they don't make any more advances than they already have.
Great, thanks. Yun, have you got anything to add on that, on the issue of whether this, from your perspective as a China analyst, does this tell you anything new about China's strategic preferences or tactics?
Thank you, Arzan, and thank you for having me for this event. It's a true honor to be on this panel. If there's anything new that I would like to note, I would say it is China's aggressiveness is growing, and China's tolerance for risks and consequences from those aggressiveness is also growing. And we could argue that these, the origin of China's increased tolerance for risk and its aggressiveness is endogenous or exogenous. There are different opinions as for which one is a true reason. But the consequence inevitably is that the differences and the competition and the hostility between China and India has grown. And some of this gap has become so large that it may not be able to be compensated for. So I think the implication for the United States, which has identified greater power competition as almost the main theme of our national security strategy, I think there's no better chance to create more leverage that the US has been given more leverage and more opportunity to strengthen the cooperation and coordination with allies and partners. Thank you.
So that's actually a perfect segue to my next question for Joe. What about the other side? Does this crisis reveal for US policymakers any new information or any updates on how to regard India as a security partner, which of course for now a couple of decades the US has declared is a key security partner in the region. Does this crisis tell us anything new about that?
I think it gives us, an appreciation that India it's going to be an assertive, forward-leaning partner, and it's willing to defend its own sovereignty. But it's certainly a partner that lives in a very dangerous neighborhood. So we've got concerns about, China and Pakistan. How might this partner be able to, address their threats in their own neighborhood? It's really going to stretch India's resources. But certainly, a strong and capable, independent India that's assuming its natural place in the region as a power. That's not just in India's interest, but in all the countries that are committed to this rules-based order and keeping the region free and open. So I think India is demonstrating this. It's going to stand up for its sovereignty, but we want to work with it, but it's going to be, it's in a dangerous place, and we need to be cognizant of that.
So when you say that we want to work with it, what do you have in mind there? What types of support could the US profitably give India that would actually make a difference, and that the US would be willing to provide in a crisis such as this?
Sure, and I'm a big believer in building the US-India relationship, and I think we can and should do more for this India. We've designated it as a major defense partner. We hold it at a level commensurate with our closest allies. And I think conditions are better now than they've ever been for us to actually provide substantive support for India. Think about the developments just in the recent years. We passed STA1 status. We passed a number of enabling agreements like the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, which really allows us to share more, or be more interoperable, with communication security, the Industrial Security Annex. We can share more technology and more defense systems now than ever, and I think we should. I think India, we should share with them our very best technology. I mean, there's some challenges. There's some concerns, for example, over its relationship with Russia and some of its legacy systems. But let's do more. I mean, we can see, they've got Black Hawk helicopters, Apaches. This is the first non-treaty partner ever to be offered what we call a Missile Technology Control Regime Category 1 UAV, the Sea Guardian, and that is really significant. So we're on a good trajectory, and we should be. And it's in India's interest to do more with the United States, and to share more, to increase their interoperability.
Again, great segue, because I now want to bring in Tanvi. We've spoken about the sort of possibility of the US providing rapid procurement to India of UAVs, for example, during this crisis. But Tanvi, the extent of US-India cooperation outwardly has been pretty small during the crisis. So let me ask you the flip side. No matter what the US wants to do, with India. What is India willing to do, especially in the midst of a militarized crisis, to gain US support?
I think it's not a question so much of what India is willing to do to gain US support, because I think, you know, the US policymakers, whether that's been from the administration or from Capitol Hill, from both parties, have been the only, I think, I might be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure the US is the only major country that's actually come out and by name criticized Chinese actions, to use force to try to change the status quo. And so I think it's been more a question of, okay, what are the things the US could do? I think some of it will be depending on, you know, what does India want? I think some of it will depend on how the crisis develops. We've already seen a change from what India would have wanted, say in May or June, to what, you know, it said over the summer. And so I think a few different things. One, and this will depend on kind of the duration ahead, as well as how what might actually happen on the ground. But I think one, diplomatic support, including in perhaps regional institutions, and this issue is unlikely to be brought up at a place like the UN Security Council, but there are other areas that the US has offered support to India, sometimes along with France, when China moves to take certain actions, often to support Pakistan, for instance, happened just a month ago again, in this case with Russia staying silent. Also rhetorical support, and I think, you know, in the beginning, and India wants a balance. It wants the US to express concern, make clear where it stands, but also not say anything to escalate the situation. And so that's why in Doklam in 2017, and Joe will remember this, you know, the idea was India didn't want the US to say anything. It wanted to try to handle this on its own. And so this time you've seen a change where there were clear signals coming out that the Indian government did not necessarily want the US to say very much at the beginning. Then you heard a lot more statements. And now again, you've, I think, heard a little bit of a dialing down. Perhaps there's regular contact between the two governments, that India, you know, would like this to try to calm down as much as possible. Just briefly, two other things, or maybe three. One is capabilities, as Joe said. You know, whether it's technology, military capabilities, intelligence sharing potentially. And now, you know, this is where, when people ask all the agreements that have been signed, most of which, I think all of which are not public, what are these being signed about for? It is so that these things can be provided, that you know, intelligence can be shared, that things can be fast-tracked. And so I think, you know, fast-tracking some of that military equipment, as you said, might be something. I'd say two other things besides capabilities. One, potentially you could see India wanting the US to do some signaling. Now that doesn't have to mean military maneuvers, but for example, the Quad meeting that we saw ministerial, that's a way of signaling, and not just the US, to show that, look, the four major powers think this is not exactly a great idea. And then finally, I'd say, what does India want from the US, particularly as we go into an election? And the likelihood might be that the crisis continues through it. It will want to see consistency, that, you know, you're hearing the same message, and that a new administration will not take a different posture and say, you know, we don't need to actually press China on this front, to try to think about this differently.
Great, thank you. And I'm just wary of the time. So Joe, I might ask you one final question from the US point of view. What we've seen, not only on this LAC crisis, but also all around China, as you alluded to, was a posture of aggressiveness, and as Yun alluded to, a posture of aggressiveness that really is a departure from the norm. And I wonder, if you're sitting in Washington and you see a number of US allies, both treaty allies, but also putative strategic partners like India, in a situation of increased tension, or in India's case, in a situation of a militarized crisis and skirmish, does this give the US any pause, or force American policymakers or military planners to start thinking about the implications of a closer US relationship with these countries? might a crisis such as this cause the US to think differently about its commitments in the region, wary of being dragged into a militarized crisis or conflict in the Indo-Pacific? And then, of course, we're talking about India here, but that obviously has implications across the region into Southeast Asia as well.
Sure. No, it's a great question. I mean, we certainly don't want to be pulled into a conflict recklessly, unnecessarily, but Arzan, neither do we want to be viewed as an unreliable partner. I mean, everyone's watching the United States when its allies and partners have their interests threatened and how we respond. So it's a really tough balance to walk. You know, if you look at, for example, remember back in 2012 during the Scarborough Shoal standoff with China, you know, the Philippines, treaty ally of the United States, and then some people looking back argue that maybe we didn't act decisively enough to help our treaty ally in that case. And I think, you know, recently you've seen Secretary Pompeo clarify our alliance commitments, that, you know, clarify the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, and even acknowledging that the rulings of the 2016 ruling of The Hague that really looked at China's 9-dash line and made, you know, recognize that it had no basis in international law. So I think this is a challenge for the United States. We want to be viewed as an international or a reliable partner, and we have to take appropriate steps to you know, support our allies and partners around the region. But then again, we owe it to our own domestic constituency not to recklessly get pulled into a conflict that's not in our interest. So that's a long way of saying it. It's a tough balance to walk, but I do think there's certainly our national defense strategy. Everything we do to compete with China is going to be done with allies and partners. So we need to make sure that we're viewed as reliable, and so we can maintain those close relationships that are going to be required to compete.
Excellent. No, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Let's turn now to the implications of the crisis for the India-China strategic competition. The standoff, as I said in the intro, seems to be headed towards a long, drawn-out, dug-in standoff that will probably endure right through the winter, at least into next year. So I wonder if that's the situation on the ground, and this is a question for both Tanvi and Yun, what are the interests of India and China, of Delhi and Beijing, to resolve this? To what extent would the leaderships in each country pay a domestic or international political cost to letting this drag on? Or if we put it another way, how much risk, how intent are they to resolve this crisis, and therefore how much risk might they accept in attempting to resolve this crisis? Tanvi, you want to start?
Sure. I think, you know, it really, I think it's always a kind of balance of risk, right? So I think on the one hand, what are the risks of this continuing? I think the most obvious one is obviously escalation. And this could happen it could be inadvertent. So it doesn't have to be necessarily a choice, but something inadvertent. You could see, for instance, I mean, the other risk is obviously in lives, even if they're not hostilities. You know, in the winter, and we've seen this in Siachen, it could lead to fatalities and casualties, just the terrain and the weather. And I think there are a couple of others risks that you could think about, which is in terms of state capacity and resources, especially as India is tackling both an economic and a health crisis. And so, you know, I think those are the risks of this continuing. Having said that, I think, you know, this government has to, the government will weigh that against the risks of doing anything to resolve this. And so I think those risks include, I think there's a set of domestic risks. I think one set of these are military, which is, you know, there's still a lot we don't know about what's happening on the ground, what exact positions, but one military risk potentially is that there are certain areas that the Chinese now have a presence in that are really strategic, and that it is a loss for India, even if it's more in an operational sense, and there's a risk of like letting that go if you move away from that restoration of status quo ante demand. I think the second is political. You know, the Modi government does not want to be the Modi government is a better position perhaps to manage this risk, but nonetheless, and it has tried by saying, you know, not actually acknowledging that there's been movement, etc. But regardless, there is a risk that they don't want to be seen as having lost territory that India claims, especially since they've often used it to target the opposition for being weak. I think a couple of other risks I will point out that I think, you know, there will be a risk, there is a risk that, say, India accepts the fait accompli that the PLA would have kind of established. There is a risk when you say it is okay for countries, whatever their concerns may be, that they resolve it by force and don't use the mechanisms in place. And what's to say that China won't read that as an opening, as a sign of weakness, as an opening to press its claims elsewhere? When will it end, so to speak? Now you can say that China's claim lines are defined, etc. But regardless, I think there's that risk about China misreading what any kind of concessions that India makes or any acceptance. And I think finally, you know, whether or not it's an important risk, I think it will be in the back of policymakers' minds. It's a risk regionally and globally of India seen as accepting. Now, many people don't want to see India escalate this, so kind of dislodge the PLA by force. But at the same time, there's a risk. I think having said that, that's less of a risk, because I think this whole crisis has, as Yun has written eloquently, shown, you know, it has reinforced this thing of China as an aggressive, I think Yun used the word bully in certain quarters. And so I think there's less of that. So I think that the first two risks, I think, are more. And so I think it will be hard. And there have been crises where India, I mean, you know, the 1980s crisis, it lasted for a very long time with forces across the border. So I don't think India can actually come out and say that it's going to accept this, so to speak. So I don't know what the end of the crisis would mean in this case. You could still have a standoff for ages, even if you dial down on the crisis aspect.
Right, no, that's exactly right. And we've seen a handful of Indian commentators or more talk about a sort of virtually permanent situation where the LAC begins to look more like the LOC in Kashmir. So let me turn it to you, and I think Tanvi's phrasing of the question was a good one. Where do you see the balance of risks is from Beijing's point of view? Do decision makers in Beijing see any incentive to quote unquote end or resolve this crisis? Because it seems like their interests are served by just freezing where everything is right now, because essentially they control the ground that they seem to have wanted to control.
I think that's very right. And I really like Tanvi's framing of the issue. Honestly, for all my following of how the Chinese reports on the issue, how the Chinese analyze the issue, currently the standoff with India is no longer in the news cycle. You don't see it being reported or even referred to by, say, the Xinhua News Agency. You look at the homepage of Xinhua News, and you won't see it anywhere mentioned. So I think what that indicates is that in the Chinese perception, unless there's some unexpected and uncontrollable incidents and events on the front line, I get the sense that this round of crisis is already over for China. China changed the status quo. There's a new fait accompli, and India might want to push China to reverse that. But I think the Chinese are quite comfortable that the Indians won't have the resources or the capacity to reverse what has already been changed on the ground. So I think the risk tolerance on the Chinese side really peaked during the first half of September. That's where you see people talking about, well, maybe we do need to fight a preemptive war, a war to end all this harassment and then end all the disputes and conflicts on the border. But that option is no longer is no longer on the surface. So I think the risk tolerance is still high, meaning that China is willing to put up with a standoff on the front line. But I think there's a difference between risk tolerance and the perception of risk. So for the Chinese, the risk tolerance is still high, but for the Chinese, the risk itself has subsided. So that's a difference. And coming to what does it take to end the crisis, I agree with Tanvi. I think it really depends on how you define ending the crisis. If the definition is a mutual withdrawal, mutual disengagement, like we saw after the Doklam event standoff in 2017, I think it is unlikely to fly this time around, because the ending to the Doklam standoff has been interpreted by many as China losing and India winning. And I think for this round, China would rather stick to this current standoff instead of accepting a result where China ostensibly lost. So standoff is not an unacceptable result for China at this point, especially if you take into consideration the domestic situation in China. The COVID-19 is under control. Chinese economy is showing positive signs of growth, 3.2% in the second quarter. And more importantly, there's a political consensus in China. Because it is an authoritarian country and the government can control the public opinion, there is a consensus. Unlike in India, there's debate between the ruling party and the opposition party. The Chinese Communist Party does not have that worry. So based on these three considerations, I think the Chinese believe they have a higher capability to stage or to sustain this standoff than India. That even coming to the frontline military supplies, logistic supplies, China may not have the most advanced capability in the whole world, but I think when it compares itself to India, it believes that its resources or the abundance of resources and is this ability to craft a policy and to just implement it without much of domestic debate has brought a lot of confidence to China, at least to sustain this current standoff. And more importantly, I think for the Chinese standoff is a demonstration of an attitude. An attitude that China is not going to make the concessions on the western sector of the disputed border. Because when the Chinese look at the border dispute with India, they always take the three sectors into consideration at the same time. So although this time the standoff and the crisis really happened between Aksaching and Ladakh, basically only in the western sector, but in the Chinese calculation, they always look at what has happened in the eastern sector and the middle sector, and what is happening with the western sector. And I think the conclusion that the Chinese has drawn is that the line of actual control, although not officially delineated between China and India for the eastern sector and the central sector, they are already being consolidated. Although there's no official document, but on the ground, the line of control is relatively clear, especially for the two militaries on the front line. So for the western sector to form or to formulate a de facto line of actual control, I'm sorry to say this, but standoff and this mutual pulling and hauling, pushing and hushing, and this mutual consolidation is almost required for a line of actual control to emerge on the western sector. Thank you.
That's really interesting. So what you're suggesting is that we have now, in effect, a new status quo on the ground, at least in the western sector, and that China is perfectly happy to maintain this new status quo on the western sector. And interestingly, I don't know if I read this correctly or incorrectly, but it seemed that the readout from the last Corps Commanders meeting no longer really referred to, on the Indian side, returning to the status quo ante, which had been and remains, as I understand it, the core Indian demand or objective, but it seems to have been dropped from the last military talks agreement, where they just essentially said, let's just freeze where things are now. So Tanvi, obviously the Chinese are happy with this new status quo, but is there any way that to the domestic audience, the Indian government can sell or somehow obfuscate away this idea that we now have a new LAC or a new status quo in the Western sector? Is there any way that this is tolerable by the Indian side?
Well, I mean, part of it is that, you know, we've seen that Prime Minister Modi can sell a lot to the public, so that remains to be seen. But, you know, questions will be asked, and I think what Beijing should worry about is, yes, India has a debate, but the debate right now is not about not being or whether we should, you know, the Indian government or the opposition saying we should accommodate China or not. The debate is, why isn't the government doing more to push back against China? So, you know, in that sense, there is a consensus that this is not acceptable. Now, I think what the debate is, what do you want to do to whether to reverse that? What's the right move next? But it's not about whether to be kind of more accommodative. And so I think there is a question, and this is a question that, you know, Beijing has to judge on its own, which is, sure, if they might think that they've established a new status quo at the boundary, they've also established a new status quo in the relationship to their detriment. And there will be no restoration of normality in the relationship or even stability in the relationship, as a number of Chinese officials have called for, without the boundary issue being tackled and managed. And I think what this is a reminder of is that there had been a whole school of thought in India, as there was in other parts of the world, that you could, you know, put these disputes in a box. And that's what the agreements were. You could manage these disputes through, and these were a set of mechanisms that India and Pakistan don't have, through these agreements and norms and protocols, and that's broken down. And some Indian officials and former Indian officials have talked about it as being violated, and that if it's now out of the box, you cannot separate geopolitics and economics and educational exchanges. And so I think what you've seen across the board now is, if there's going to be a new status quo at the boundary, and as long as this status quo doesn't return to what it was in late April, I think you're not going to see any reversal. In fact, you'll continue to see these movements in India that will push India kind of to be more kind of, I think, close to engagement with China than it has been for decades. So, you know, that is a choice. And so to me, a big question is, you know, when you think about, was it worth it? And I think, you know, Yun said this, talked about China's India dilemma, written about it. Taylor Fravel said this, it's a question of you choosing sovereignty claims or stability. I would say it's also about sovereignty claim and strategy, because maybe I'm kind of not very strategic, but I don't really understand the point of getting everybody around you, almost every country around you, not to mention throw in kind of Europe and the US and Canada upset at you at the same time. Maybe I'm just an armchair strategist, but that doesn't strike me as very smart.
So this gets to the heart of the next question that I want to ask, which is essentially, you know, as you've both written about, the Indians are hoping that by holding the entire bilateral relationship between China and India at risk, that is a point of leverage that India can bring to bear on resolving the LAC crisis, that India can threaten a permanent rupture in this bilateral relationship, or at least a rupture in certain sectors like the tech sector with the app ban, etc. So the question I have is, for each of you, the flip side of this same question, which is, Tanvi, do you see any points of leverage that India has? Let's put aside the military, because I'm of the view probably that there's very few good military options. But aside from the military options on the ground, do you see any policy options that India could generate or mobilize that would actually have leverage over China? And then the flip side of that question to you, Yun, is, would that actually be any leverage over China? Does China actually care about a permanent rupture in the relationship with India, or does it expect that rupture either already happened or was inevitable, so it's a cost that they've already paid? Tanvi?
I mean, so, you know, I think you mentioned some of them, which is, you know, and I think broadly, it is the broad relationship. It's the economic market that India has. It is the partnerships that it could deepen much more than it has in the past, even though Beijing might think, well, it's going to do it anyway. Actually, India is, as folks in the US will tell you, and in a number of other places, including Australia and other places, India is held back because of Chinese concern, the Chinese reaction. So I think, you know, you can see these kind of, whether it's using partnerships, whether it's using these policies. Having said that, I think, you know, that's what the government has been trying to do. And I think so far they seem to be getting the message that Beijing doesn't particularly care about that. And so I think it's going to, now there are other options, but those are more escalatory, whether that is, you know, Tibet or Taiwan, you know, maritime deployments. But I think those are things that India, you know, and each one of these, there's a tit for tat possible. So then you get into that kind of spiral potentially. So I think there are leverage, but the other side has to think. I will say one thing about, I don't think the things, you know, if you're thinking about the tech ban, and the tech ban gets a lot more attention, but there's been a slew of measures, whether that is, and some of it is to COVID times, not even FDI scrutiny, considering doing it for foreign portfolio investment as well. You know, public procurement rules have been changed. State governments are restricting. So, and not to mention more scrutiny of any exchanges with think tanks, with universities, etc. And so when, I think it might have actually, I don't know if it was this week, but it was just about a year ago that Xi Jinping and Modi met. They had this kind of, you know, 70 events they were going to do the 70th anniversary this year, particularly to deepen economic, civil society and media ties and people-to-people ties. This is the exact opposite. This is unraveling. So I think it's not just about leverage. I think these, if they keep going, and they come from broader concerns that India has had for a long time about overdependence and overexposure to China, growing Chinese influence, and Chinese companies who are close to the state making inroads in India. And this has been the moment that has essentially changed their mind and made some people within government win the debates about what to do with China. So I think it's leverage perhaps, but I think regardless, these are things that have turned the debate in India in a way that is separate from these just being used as leverage.
I'll just add from, I think I'm trying to gauge what is the Chinese calibration about their leverage and what they gain from this round of prices, right? If you look at the strategic environment, like Tanvi has already pointed out, that China is in a pretty hostile neighborhood. And some would argue that there is already an anti-China coalition emerging in the world. And these all, and I have heard many Indian strategists point to this fact that India is in a pretty good position in terms of its external environment. And China is facing with all these problems. So therefore, I think the implied message is that China should have made the concession. And I think this mentality of leverage, which is quite prevalent in both China and India, I don't know how healthy or constructive it really is, because both countries have leverage against each other, and both can inflict damages upon each other. We can argue as for which side has more detrimental capability or has more leverage to damage the core interest of the other side. But I think if we're going in that direction, then this is going to be a lose-lose situation, and there's no winner in that. I think it's still clear for Chinese strategy that China's primary competition or the primary competitor is not India, it's the United States. So before that changes, India is not going to become the primary threat for China, and South Asia is not going to become China's primary theater or the strategic direction for China. So for China, I think when I try to understand what is the Chinese logic when they made this choice, I think the question for China is that, can China influence or shape India's strategic choice? Meaning that is India's strategic alignment subject to the influencing or the shaping by Chinese behaviors, by China's action or inactions? In other words, if China makes a concession, will India not align with the United States? So if India believes that because its external environment has improved, therefore China should make a concession, then will the territorial dispute be the end of the Indian asks or the Indian demand? So, and I think the next question for China is that, what if China delivers, and for the next step, India asks China to stop supporting Pakistan? Or India asks China to stop Belt and Road in South Asia. Otherwise, India is going to form the alliance or alignment with the United States. Then should China say yes or no? So I think when I try to understand China's strategic logic, these list of questions will emerge, and essentially points to the question that that is India's strategic choice really up for influencing by China. So we also written about this, that the nature of the demand between India and China to each other is different, is asymmetrical. What China wants from India is neutrality, and not to follow US to contain China. And this strategic choice by nature is reversible and is ephemeral. But for the things that India has demanded China, whether it's a territorial concession or the designation of Pakistani terrorist organization, or the membership of a nuclear supply group for India. So all these decisions are irreversible. So these are hard commitments. So I think the different nature of this type of demands from India and China to each other has determined that the leverage that India can use against China is repeatable. It can be used repeatedly. But for the Chinese, in their calculation, their leverage towards India, once they give up the leverage, they just lose it forever. So there's also this question of the prioritization of national interest. Even if China does not want to see India and US to align with each other, but can China use territorial integrity or use disputed territory to pay the cost or pay the price of it? So in the current narrative, and this I do agree with Taylor Fravel, I think in the current narrative in China today, to pay the price with Chinese disputed territory is going to have a direct impact over the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So therefore, it is not a politically acceptable solution for China. So I think, and if you talk to really hardliners in China about this logic that China is in a weak spot and India is in a pretty strong spot internationally, so therefore China should make the concession. And the pushbacks that I have been given, I've been confronted, is that using the logic, if India and the United States, India does decide to form, say, an alignment or alliance with the United States, then there's no room for maneuver for China in terms of its policy towards India. So that could indicate a much more hostile policy from China towards India than what we're seeing today. And it also means that both countries could resort to leverages that in the past that they had refused to use. So I think the Chinese are also arguing that if India does not want to turn China into its enemy, then India probably should be more cautious in terms of its alignment choices as well. So these are how the Chinese are processing the information. I don't necessarily agree with their logic, but I think they do have their own logic. Thank you.
Well, let me just say, and I think part of the thing is, it's self-fulfilling, which is, when you have somebody like Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, a former ambassador to China, former foreign secretary, China hand, national security advisor, saying this is going to be a more adversarial relationship. He chooses his language very carefully. The fact that he's using a term like adversary, that the prime minister, even if he didn't name China, essentially used a term like rival or adversary. It means that China has kind of made and especially if there is this logic that this is inevitable competition, but it has made this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, it has made it true. And so when there's talk of, for example, concessions, these are not concessions. This is going back on something that was done that most countries see as a kind of going against international norms, if not law, and the kind of rules-based order. So when everybody talks about the rules-based order, sometimes people roll eyes, but this is what it means, that when you have differences, particularly if you've got a set of mechanisms, if you have concerns, bring them up in those conversations. And I do think it points to a broader issue, which is, there have been a number of statements about kind of how China has seen certain moves or what it can, how it can influence India or not. But it suggests to me that there are some folks who haven't seen the pattern of kind of Indian behavior in the past. And I've said repeatedly, if you look at Indian actions, you would not have a close US-India relationship today without Chinese actions that have concerned India. You would not see a Quad ministerial, let alone, or a Quad for that matter, without concerns about Chinese assertiveness. These are thanks to China. And so if China doesn't like these things, it should look in the mirror about who is responsible. Now, I understand countries tell themselves different stories about these things, but it does worry me because it tells me that their assessments of India are not quite correct. And I suspect there are a lot of things you could point to where you could say Indian assessments of Beijing's kind of thinking have not proven to be correct. But I think the one thing you will see during this crisis is there seems to be just the damage to trust on both sides of the relationship, or at least what one gets a sense from a lot of folks in India who worked on the relationship, that there's been a real damage of trust that I think will be very, very hard to rebuild.
Well, I will just add to that and say that, well, if we're going to go to who started what first and when, we can probably go back to 1950 or 1959 to or 1956, depending on how earlier you want to go. And I think for the most recent round, I think both sides have taken actions to change the status quo, whether it is the infrastructure development, whether it is construction of a mud road in the Galvan Valley, and whether it is the completion of the DBO road last year, where it was a revoke of the Article 370 and declare Aksai as a part of Ladakh Union Territory later in November. I think if we want to go back to history and see who did what first, this is going to be an endless debate. And I think it's fair to say that both sides have taken actions that are not necessarily stabilizing. And then in terms of how to react to that, good relations and bad relations, by the end of the day, they're all means, they're not an ends. If countries believe that a bad relationship will serve their national interests better, they will accommodate, they will live with a bad relationship. So like Tanvi, you just mentioned that the debate currently going on in India is not about what to do with China, but why the current government has not taken a tougher position on China. I think that's something that the Chinese are observing too. Why did Modi declare, for example, in June that no incursion happened? And why is India not taking the actions that the opposition parties have advocated for? So I think there is, at least in the Chinese perception, there are internal disputes.
So cognizant of the time, and we've got a handful of questions come through, let me try and synthesize some of these questions and put essentially one last question to you both. Yun, when you said, for example, that both sides have taken steps that have destabilized the situation, I mean, of course, both sides have done things in their own territory that may have rankled the other side, but only one side has lodged a multiple, simultaneous, and essentially permanent military incursion into the territory of the other side. So, I mean, there is a history to this that we can pass, but this crisis was quite clearly triggered by a qualitatively different action, which was this military incursion that has not yet ended. But on that point of, and a lot of these questions are sort of retrospective, asking about the causes of this, about which side perceives the other having done what. Everything from the Article 370 issue to the infrastructure development on both sides, although differentially on both sides. And so I don't want to sort of get hung up on the technicalities or the details of what has happened. I want rather to use that as the context for a question about the future. This event is titled "On the Watershed," which was a ham-fisted pun because Ladakh is both a geographic watershed area, but also from what you both have been saying today, it sounds like there is a watershed in this relationship. so if I can ask you each to provide your sort of concluding comments, one after the other. I might ask Yun first and then Tanvi second. My question is not looking purely at the bilateral relationship between India and China, but looking at how each country, China and then India, looks at its world. How has this crisis shaped its foreign policy, its defense policy, its military strategy going forward to deal with the world outside? So it sounds like from what Yun has been saying so far that there are few perceived costs in Beijing to this sort of more aggressive and risk-taking behavior. It seems to be, according to their internal logic, a winning strategy. Is that true? And if that's true, then do we therefore, going forward, expect to see more of this? And then for Tanvi, similarly, not looking just at India's relationship with China, but also more broadly when you've written about how this relationship may precipitate a closer relationship with the US, but also how does this crisis affect India's approach to not just the US, but to its view of its place in the region, and its view of what types of instruments of statecraft work and don't work. So what I have in mind here is that, you know, a lot of critics of the current government in India have said that the summit diplomacy that Modi had focused on for a couple of years clearly doesn't work, and so India needs to take a harder line, not just on China, but therefore against any adversary. So what lessons will India take from this crisis in the way it conducts foreign and defense policy going forward?
Thank you, Arzan, for that question. I think my assessment is that China is winning the battle, but China is also losing the war. I think technically, whatever military position that China thinks it has improved on the front line is not going to help the overall posture and it's in the region, and it's not going to help China's case in terms of this image of being the aggressive power that uses military forces to change things, no matter how unhappy or how big the problem is. So I think in terms of the optics of things and the narratives of things, and also the strategic long game, I don't think this is a winning strategy. But on the ground, I think the Chinese military tactics or the options that they have opted for is very difficult to reverse. And I think the crisis has increased both Chinese and Indian threat perceptions of each other. And I've heard a lot of argument in both China and India that no love is lost, given the long-standing issues between the two and the deeply embedded distrust of each other's strategic intentions. However, I would still argue that distrust and problems are fundamentally different from hostility and confrontation, because hostility and confrontation would suggest an active policy to undermine the other side. So in the foreseeable future, I don't see China's assessment of India as a secondary threat and South Asia as a secondary theater is going to change anytime soon. But I think the events this year have forced China to come face to face with a long list of factors in a real scenario of a military conflict with India. And this includes the heightened and sustained escalation of tension, the military planning, mobilization, preparation necessitated by it, and the growing possibility of a real conflict with India on the Western sector. So I think all this war preparation, they could also be the self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you prepare for it, the more you feel it is inevitable, and the more you're likely to pursue the policy during the next round. If anything, I say the Chinese tolerance for a bad relationship with India, including a conflict if imposed, has increased significantly. And this is categorically different from the previous conviction that China is and will always be risk-averse vis-a-vis India, and therefore would avoid a conflict with India at all costs. It doesn't mean that China will actively seek a war with India, but it does suggest that China is prepared to defend its military positions, even if a conflict is inevitable. So I think the bluffs are and will be called. I agree that this leadership summit is not going to help. The abrupt and short-lived nature of the post-Doklam rapprochement from 2018 and 19 illustrates how fragile and unsustainable such quick fixes will be. And the realistic conflict between the two countries are extremely deep to remove easily. But the silver line, as I see, if I try to be optimistic, is that the strategic value of this military post in the Western sector might be questionable, or at the minimum debatable. There are emotional, political, legal, historical, military considerations on both sides that have hindered a practical solution. So confrontations, standoffs, incidents will likely become more regular as the two sides consolidate their line of actual control, because there's no consensus between the two sides over what the line of actual control really is. So I think the consolidation will continue until there's no more ambiguity and no more room for imagination regarding their actual positions. And that future line of actual control will serve as a foundation and the beginning of a real border negotiation between China and India. So if there's any silver lining from all the tension that has happened and all the tension to come, that might be it. Thank you.
I will say, I mean, it is a watershed moment for a number of reasons, right? I mean, on the one, you cross certain thresholds that haven't been crossed in decades. That alone makes it different, you know, whether it is kind of fatalities at the boundary on both sides, whether it is the fact that this took place at multiple points and not just one, whether it's duration. But I think there's also kind of a more kind of operational reasons for it, which is that the structure that had been built from kind of 1993 onwards for almost 2 decades has broken down. And so that doesn't mean you throw out all these agreements, but however these countries decide to get back to the table, and after all, they're still using these mechanisms. I mean, it is interesting that not, you know, China and India is still engaging in ways that India and Pakistan don't in the middle of a crisis. And the mechanisms exist, and they're still using these mechanisms. Now you can say that, look, it's all, this crisis has proved they're ineffective. So they either need to be updated, adjusted. But I think what you're left with regardless is there's a sense that these, when rubber hit the road, these agreements didn't matter. That in the Indian mind, that the Chinese did not stick to the agreements. So whatever agreement you sign in the future, at the back of India's mind, and this is connected to your question about what works and what doesn't, there will now have to be an understanding in India that whatever you sign in terms of an agreement, whatever, that it is it is likely that the other side might not actually meet it. So you have to be prepared for that contingency. And so the criticism is that maybe the government's depended too much on these agreements. And if the idea is that, as Yoon said, and if that was a silver lining, it actually scares me that there's going to be a continued consolidation of the claims, even more so. That's actually quite worrying. Because if Beijing continues to say that we need to use this moment to consolidate our claims further and try to kind of make a new kind of LAC or get to the 1959 claim line, that's actually still a lot of territory. And so that's actually quite destabilizing. And so I think, you know, if you ask me what does India think versus what I think India should be thinking about its capabilities, I agree with you. And I think, you know, the summits, I think in some ways, perhaps too much expectation was put on them. I was never a believer, as you know, Arzan, in this idea that there was some reset. I saw these as, you know, they're mechanisms to try to kind of reach a consensus, but I think people made too much of a big deal, including the Indian government. I think they made too much of a big deal when even they didn't actually expect that much of it other than a stabilizing of the relationships. And it's going to be very hard for somebody like Prime Minister Modi to justify to the Indian people, because it has echoes of what Prime Minister Nehru did. And the narrative in India, whether you agree with it or not, but in the Indian mind, it was, you know, Nehru did symmetry with Zhou Enlai, and then, you know, the Chinese betrayed us. And so, you know, this is Modi does not want to be Prime Minister Modi does not want to be in a similar situation that opens him up to criticism. To me, I think the broader questions, and I will not kind of go on about all the trade-offs, and I wrote a piece for Times of India, if people are interested, they can read. I think the question for India is, does this moment make Indian policymakers make the trade-offs, whether they're economic, whether they're political, whether they're geopolitical, that they have not been willing to make in the past because they thought they had time with China, that they did not need to make. And this is not just kind of military or even, how much to align. I think absent a major escalation, you're not going to see kind of an alliance. India just, it does not, and frankly, nobody's offering an alliance, right? And so I think the question is, even things like, is India willing to do what it takes to get back to kind of an economic growth that will help it with resources and capabilities? Because without that, and that requires hard political choices, are Indian governments willing to make that? And frankly, if they don't start closing the gap, then this is constantly going to be a source of pressure and something that they feel you have to find a way to reestablish deterrence. And part of that is not just with the military, but heft as well. And I'm not sure, and we shall see if the Indian government has quite, understood that, or maybe they've understood, but are they willing to make the hard choices? And I suspect, that's going to be a different set of choices that I think but I'm not a politician who also needs to win elections. So it's easy for me to say.
That is excellent. Thank you so much, Tanvi. Thank you, Yunsun. Thank you, in absentia, Joe Felter. That really wraps up a lot of the issues that I think were sort of the subtext of a lot of our discussion today, that both sides operate with their own internal logics that sometimes are hard to understand by the other side or by third parties. And that often, as IR theorists would say, lead to spirals of tension and conflict. And that each side needs to make very difficult trade-offs. And that in order to make these trade-offs, you can't get everything you need. And so in order to make these trade-offs, political leaders and planners need to do the hard work of prioritizing and planning what actually matters the most. And again, when they fail to do that, they wind up in a spiral of crisis and conflict. So thank you again, Tanvi, Yunsun, and Joe Felter. That concludes today's event. So keep your eye on APARC's website for these event announcements. Sign up to APARC's South Asia newsletter and follow us each individually and APARC institutionally on Twitter for these conference announcements. Once again, thank you guys. To everyone out there, stay safe, listen to science and wear a mask, and hopefully look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.